Welcome to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson and I ask my guests one simple question. Why? Focusing on the importance of why, I share with you the relatable, uplifting and inspiring conversations I have with people from all walks of life. This podcast will encourage you to focus on your why to enable and empower you to achieve the success you desire. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why. So today on the Focus on Why podcast, I am joined by Keith Harris. Keith, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
It is lovely to have you here. It's very nice. I can't believe it's been 19 years since I last saw you.
I know I'm shocked by that, to be perfectly honest.
It's crazy. I don't know where the time has gone. Well, let me just give the audience a little bit of a background on who you are. In fact, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let you just wade in and tell everybody what it is you're doing right now, and then they can work out who you are and what you do and why you do it themselves.
Well, right now I'm at that happy period where I would describe myself as kind of semi-retired. I mean, I still do some things. You know, I still do some music business training. I'm on the board of a few charities that I work for, the MIDI Music Company, Universal Music Sound Foundation, English Folk Expo, and I'm a executive director at a studio called Point Blank Studios. And I am an advisor to an organization called In Place of War. But these are not really full-time occupations, none of them. But that's kind of what I'm doing these days.
So that doesn't sound semi-retired to me. That sounds pretty busy. But were you busier before?
Yeah, I used to be busy. Now I'm relatively relaxed. Because I guess because most of these things aren't paying jobs. I don't feel under the same kind of pressure as when I'm working for an organization that's actually paying me. Only one of those things actually pays me. So but that's not true actually. Universal pay me. And the Performing Rights Society paying for training. But generally speaking, most of what I do is stuff that I want to do.
So what did you used to do before? Share that with us.
Before that, I'm best known, if I'm known at all, as a music industry manager. And the thing that kind of attracts attention, should I say, is the fact that I've worked with Stevie Wonder for 42 years. We started working together when I was the general manager of the Motown label in the UK. And then I went to LA to work directly with him. And since then, I've been a music industry manager. That's really been my bread and butter.
Yeah. And how did it all start? What sort of spurred you into music?
I think it started, to be perfect honest, it probably started with my mother. My mother always used to play what for those days was pop music around the house. And I really liked it. We used to listen to something on Saturday morning called Uncle Mac's Children's Favorites, which played the kind of the pop songs of the day, which were, really kind of twee children's songs a lot of the time. But I just really liked music. And obviously pop music was what I was listening to at the time. And I was fortunate enough to be around when, the Beatles first broke, although I was already a fan of people like Lonnie Donegan and the Shadows and people like that. But when the Beatles broke and the whole popular music thing took off, I was absolutely addicted and was really motivated by that to want to be involved somehow. What actually happened was that I suppose like most people of my age, boys of my age, I learned to play guitar, wanted to be in a group, was in a group with friends, and suddenly realized that I wasn't even the best guitar player in the group, let alone the best guitar player in the world. And so probably maybe I should try and do something else, and ended up getting sort of shunted sideways into management. And so I started managing artists and then ended up working in a record company and then moving out of record company, but really just being involved in music in any way that I could.
So you followed your instinct.
Yeah. I mean, I followed what I like to say, and I think for the most part, this is true, is that I've been, incredibly lucky. You know, loads of people would like to have done a lot of things that I have done. And my daughter always chides me for saying, "Dad, you always say it's luck." I say, "Yeah, but I usually have a little addendum to that, and the addendum is from there's a South African golfer called Gary Player, and somebody once said to him, Gary Player, people say you're a lucky golfer, and he said, yeah, that might be true, but one thing I've noticed is the more I practice, the luckier I get." And I like to kind of paraphrase that and say that I've been really lucky in the music industry. But one of the things that I find to be true is the harder I work, the luckier I get. And that's kind of really what's followed me around. Because I love it so much, I'm prepared to put in the hours and the hard yards. And I think that's paid off for me.
And what have those hours and hard yards looked like?
Well, it kind of depends, who I was working for. Yeah, I'll tell you, my first record company job, I worked for a record company called Transatlantic Records. It's a very small English label, did mainly traditional folk music. And my job was to do regional radio promotions. And that involved me driving around to radio stations. And at this time, commercial radio in the UK was embryonic. Capital Radio and LBC, which were the first commercial radio stations, had been on air for less than a year. And I had to drive around and visit these stations and try to get the music that I was kind of peddling at the time played. And in about 18 months that I worked for Transatlantic Records, I drove 90,000 miles. Now, one of the reasons for that, and this kind of is a sign of the times, is that Transatlantic, it was quite a small company. And whereas with the bigger record companies, if you were doing a job like that, you kind of had an expense account, you could go out and stay in hotels and so on and so forth. This was 1975, and they only had a budget for me to get a bed and breakfast. And in my first couple of weeks, I remember finishing the day's work and trying to get a bed and breakfast. This was before you could book online or any of that kind of stuff. It was a matter of going, knocking on the door and saying, I'd like a bed for the night. Obviously they had bed and breakfast signs outside these places, and finding that I was going around 5, 6, 7 places that had vacancy signs and people saying, we haven't got any vacancies. So I thought, I can't do this. So what happened was that when I finished work every night, didn't matter where I was, I would drive home. And sometimes that meant driving back from Manchester or Glasgow, and this is in the days before the motorway system was complete. So that's why I drove so many miles, is because after work every night, I wasn't prepared to put myself through the humiliation of being turned away from bed and breakfasts. And so I basically just drove home.
That's crazy. They've been turned away.
Yeah, well, I mean, at that time, I don't think that the Race Discrimination Act had actually been passed. And so, people felt, it's their house. They had felt free to turn you away. And you can imagine that was quite common then. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows that there used to be signs on bed and breakfast saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Yeah. And it wasn't very long after that was a very common sign.
Wow, things have changed. Things have changed a lot, but there's still a long way to go.
To say the least, especially, we're recording, in the week of the whole sort of protests about George Floyd and, so on and so forth. And I've just had to remind people that although that's one extreme of what happens, it's not like that only happens in America. And racism wherever it is needs to be challenged. Even now, it's quite surprising and shocking when you see something as starkly illustrated as that. but it has a lot of smaller increments which all lead to that.
And what can you do about it?
Funnily enough, a friend of mine called me up yesterday, and he was saying, you know, in our company, we've tried to be as egalitarian as possible. We've hired people, and we always try to set out equal opportunities policies and so on. I don't really know what else I can do. And I said, well, really, what I would like people to do is challenge it. It's so easy just to stay quiet. Think to yourself, well, I don't agree with that, but I'm not going to say anything. Yeah. What people need to do is to say something, because otherwise there's a tacit understanding from the people who are being discriminatory that you agree. In their heads, if you don't say anything, they believe that what they're saying is being well received. So really all I can say to people is, where possible, call people out on it. I mean, don't put yourself in physical danger, but call people out on it. If you disagree with what they're saying and it's racist or sexist or whatever, then say something.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, and I'm really glad that we're having this conversation when we are right now, because this podcast can go out and it can make a difference. I know it will make a difference because it will be heard and people will speak out.
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's a moment, and I've kind of seen these moments, maybe not quite as extreme. I've seen these moments in the past, and it's right at the top of the agenda for a few days or a few weeks or a few months, but it doesn't stay forever. What I'd like it to stay forever.
Mm.
You know, I think everybody, certainly everybody who has children, would like their children to live in a better world, and that's our responsibility. Because a lot of the stuff that happens, it's not innate, it's taught. So if you teach people properly, then the world will be a better place.
And how much has music been a way of teaching people the moral values?
Well, obviously, there are some certain people who are more political about their music and make statements, and it has its place. I think probably where I would like to see music is just in its values as an art form, because it's a universal language. Everybody understands it. Everybody can participate. You get you get musicians together from different parts of the world who've never met, and they can sit down and play. It's got that kind of universality about it, which I don't think anything else has. Obviously, you can translate books. People understand films. You can put subtitles, but music, as soon as you hear it, it has a kind of a universal emotional appeal. So it has a very special place in terms of what it can do in terms of reaching people.
And working with someone such as Stevie Wonder for, as you said, 42 years, how has that relationship evolved over that time?
It's been quite interesting because I think that what happened was when I first met Stevie, which was in 1977, when I was still at Motown, he was, I think, 28 and I was 27. And what was remarkable was that he was born in Saginaw, raised in Detroit, had lived in America all his life. I was born in Newcastle, raised in the north of England, gone to university in Scotland, and moved to London. It was amazing how we saw eye to eye. The communality between us was remarkable, and that's kind of why the relationship has lasted so long. Because probably more than anything, we're friends. Yes, we work together and we have a working relationship, but we're friends and we see eye to eye. And it's, I think, the amazing thing, because we still talk. We've spoken a lot over the last 3 or 4 weeks, certainly over lockdown. We've spoken a lot more than we had been doing for a while, and it's still remarkable that we still see things the same way. When I was working with Stevie full time, it was quite funny how somebody would say something, and I knew what he was thinking about it, and he knew what I was thinking about it. And afterwards, when we discussed it, it was just so funny that we'd both said the same thing. Sometimes I used to say to him, "Look, you're tired. You, you just go to bed. I'll do your interview for you." Because because especially if it's on the phone, I'll just do your interview for you, because I know what you're going to say anyway. So
That's great. I love that. So what you said, you mentioned that you were working at Motown. What were you doing in Motown?
well, what happened was that in the 70s, Motown was what's known as a licensed label of EMI. So basically, they had a business deal with Motown that they would release and promote their material in the UK. And so EMI had inside their offices a little Motown office, and I worked in the Motown office. And I was the head of promotions initially. And that job involved me taking the records off to Radio 1 and what's now called Capital FM, but it was called Capital Radio in those days. And into all the pubs, and well, not pubs, but mainly the clubs, to make sure that the Motown records got as much exposure as possible. And it also involved, I guess, what would in another record company be called artist relations. So when the Motown artists came over, I'd be kind of looking after them and making sure that things were right if they were touring, and I was their point of contact. So it kind of threw me into the world of relating to these Black American artists who I'd obviously never met and were from a slightly different world. But it was it was great. For me, obviously, it was a really exciting time, because we're talking 1976. A lot of these people were just names off a record cover. So when I remember when Smokey Robinson came in, and having to look after Smokey for a week with his wife and his two children, and you're kind of pinching yourself. As I said before, I was born in Newcastle. I lived my whole life in the north of England, and then I went off to university in Scotland, and that was my world. That's what I knew. And these people were in another galaxy. You know, the Smokey Robinson, Marvin Gaye, the Supremes, the Commodores, Stevie Wonder. Obviously, all these people I was coming across and meeting, and knowing personally. Um, you know, I think the second artist that I remember coming was a lady called Thelma Houston, who had a hit record called "Don't Leave Me This Way," and it was amazing to see the way we kind of related to each other, because they didn't really. Black British people was a new thing for them. And to see that we had a sort of a kind of common touching point was really good, and that was really great for me as well.
So you literally just sort of strolled along from succession from one role to another and meeting all these incredible people and seeing music. You mentioned earlier that it changed. It was at its embryonic stages when you first started.
Yeah.
How has it evolved to where it is now, and where do you see music going?
Well, I think what happened was it's almost come full circle, because in the late 1950s, everything was really quite. It revolved around singles. Somebody had a hit song, and that then kind of made them a star. And there were a limited number of kind of entrepreneurs who were responsible for making people into the stars of the day. For instance, there was a guy called Larry Parnes, who was an impresario, as they call him in those days, who controlled a lot of the big stars. Kind of like a Simon Cowell type figure. You know, and people released singles, which then through the 60s, it became that people started releasing albums. The Beatles were kind of pioneers in so much as, I mean, off the back of off the back of Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly and the Crickets were probably the first self-contained music group that were writing their own material and performing their own material, two guitars, bass and drums, that kind of setup. And then came the Beatles. And of course, the Beatles went global. And after that, then it became normal for people to be writing their own material and performing their own material. And then people started to buy albums. The Beatles were the first group I remember, probably not the first group I remember who would release singles that weren't on their album. So then people started buying albums I mean, they were called LPs in England. I think actually Bob Harris was the person that I remember who first started talking about it being an album, in classic whispering Bob fashion. But they were called LPs, long playing records. The industry then evolved to be geared to selling kind of long playing records rather than selling singles. And what's happened is in recent years, of course, because of the way that the internet works and people being able to pick and choose just the individual tracks they like, we're now back to a market where people are buying singles about individual songs. The other parallel with when the industry first started is that in the embryonic stages, the industry was run by mavericks. It was young people, who they'd never done this before. People didn't really know how to promote a record, and people had really wacky ideas for getting things out there and getting attention, and it was all new, and people were just making their own way, and it was really exciting. And then over the years, it gradually got more formulaic and less spontaneous, and more of a traditional business. And the internet and social media have kind of given the control back to the mavericks and the creatives. So now we're seeing an upsurge. I mean, if I think about the kind of UK grime scene with people like Stormzy and so on, so they kind of did it for themselves because they had the tools to do it for themselves again. So the way I see it, the industry is actually quite exciting again because young people have taken control. We've kind of had our day, and I've loved it, but I can see a vibrance about the business now, and people kind of taking the control and taking it where they wanted to go, rather than take it where us older generation of people told them they had to take it.
And the work that you're doing now with universities and the charities and colleges and things, explain what it means to you to work with these young people.
Well, what happened was, again, from my point of view, I wasn't seeing. It sounds slightly arrogant. I wasn't seeing people like myself, coming up through the business. I'm very fortunate. I had the benefit of a British public school education, and I kind of know how to navigate the system. But most Black British people are not in that situation. And I actually wasn't seeing people like myself coming through. And when I asked the question, why not? Well, people said, well, people haven't got the qualifications, and we don't know where to look, and people aren't, it's not that we're in any way biased or prejudiced. We just can't find the people. So I thought to myself, well, actually, if we could make sure that people had the access to the information, I'm sure the people are out there. So for a long time now, I've been doing talks and seminars and workshops and that kind of stuff to help to give people the tools to be able to enter the industry. And more recently, because I got involved in that honours degree in commercial music at the University of Westminster, which was the first of its kind, and we had a very high percentage of BAME students, ethnic minorities. And interestingly enough, we had a very high proportion of ethnic minority lecturers on that course. And that was, to some extent, an attempt to make people see things in a slightly different way. Because people have always seen plenty of Black people in front of the camera, but had no idea there were so few behind. So the work that I've been doing and the things that I get involved in, a lot of them are about changing perception and giving people the opportunity to see somebody, a Black person teaching, if you like, a Black person on the other side of the business, not just as taking stuff, but giving things out. And I think that's quite important.
And have you been recognised for your work in the university stage?
Yeah, well, the University of Westminster gave me an honorary doctorate, which was you know unexpected, much appreciated. So I got that in 2007, I think. If I turned around, I'd be able to tell it
I
because
can see it on the wall. Yeah.
um, but so yeah, I did get an honorary doctorate for that, and then in 2016, I think 15 or 16, anyway, a while ago, a few years ago, I got an OBE from the Queen, which was also very nice. Yeah, so I've been recognised. I certainly can't complain about getting recognition.
And the recognition, that's important to sort of trailblaze for the generation that you're trying to inspire.
Yeah, I think people need to see people like them who have been able to do something, you know, out of the ordinary, if you like, or to on a higher level. People don't want to be at entry level for their whole career, and they'd like to be able to see that they can actually step forward. So even though I have reservations about what I have done personally, I think it's important that people see people like me, and actually, I want them to think, I could do that better than him, not as well as, you know, I could do better because there really isn't anything apart from the fact, like I say, that I'm a middle class black person with a higher level of education. I can't see anything different about me. Given the opportunity, there are thousands and thousands of young black people out there who could do what I do.
And why is it important for you to do all the work you're doing right now?
I think it's part. I think it's part of the benefit of realizing, how fortunate I've been. You know, I don't want to give the impression I've done it by myself. There have been loads of people who've helped me along the way, and once you recognize that, then you start to recognize that you ought to be helping other people too. Yeah. I think you have to have a mindset. I remember I was talking to, I think there was an artist called Gil Scott Heron, and we toured with, I mean, Gil Scott Heron was support to Stevie on a tour we did in America in the 1980s. And I remember, I think it was an interview Gil was doing, and somebody was saying, so why would you do that? I mean, and almost the question you've asked me. And his answer was, why wouldn't I? Yeah. And I think that's really the thing, which is that given the position that I'm in, given the benefits I've had and the stuff that I'm doing, I mean, why wouldn't I do that? It's the sensible thing to do. If I can help in any way to bring people through and, as we talked about earlier, ameliorate their position, it helps the whole of society. It helps, our children have a better future. It helps everybody look at things slightly differently. And for better or for worse, there are a limited number of people who are in my position that can do that. So, I intend to use what tools I have to try and improve the situation.
And why will they listen to you?
I don't know whether they will, to be perfectly honest. You know, I think one of the things that I do realize though is that what usually happens if you complain or you have an axe to grind, which I do about the treatment of minorities in society, is that people like to kind of say, yeah, well, just got a chip on their shoulder because they haven't really done very well or they haven't succeeded or they haven't, you know. So by being recognized in the way I've been recognized over the years, I think, well, for most people, that's going to eliminate that. You know, it would be strange for people to accuse me of having a chip on my shoulder when what chip could that be? You know, I've had a long career in something that I really wanted to do and have been allowed to do. I'm reasonably well off. You know, I'm not a millionaire, but I'm reasonably well off. You don't need to be a millionaire. I'm happy with my lot. I've been recognized by the Queen and others. You know, I have no chip on my shoulder. I just see things are wrong and need to say that. So hopefully it will drive things forward.
Absolutely. And seeing the work that you've done and hearing of the things that you've sort of helped facilitate in the past, I have no doubt that people will sit up and listen.
Well, I'd like to think so. I mean, like I said, I don't think that people, you know, I don't want to preach to people and I don't want to set myself up as being, you know, better than anybody. But I do think that it's much easier to stay quiet than to say something. And given the opportunity to say something, which thank you very much for giving me, I will I will get out there and say something, you know, and people take it or leave it. That's the great thing about, I suppose that's the great thing about podcasting, whatever, which is if you don't like it, you can turn it off.
Absolutely. And it's a great medium to be able to sort of express very freely what it is you want. And as you say, people can pick and choose to be your audience, and that's their free choice, just as it's
Yeah,
your free choice to come on and share your thoughts today.
yeah.
And I mean, I
Sorry, one thing I was going to say to you
mm,
is the one thing I find very liberating about, and this is going to sound a counterintuitive thing, is that one of the things I find very liberating about it is that I'm not on social media. So I say this stuff and I don't see people's reaction, you know, which I think sometimes can be off-putting and restricting. You know, I mean, I'm aware of people getting trolled on social media and people using a very negative way to put out hate and you know, I don't see any of that, so I don't care. I actually don't care. I just say what I want to say, and people take it or leave it. Like I said, then turn it off if they don't like it. I don't care.
I don't think they'll turn it off. So I hope they don't turn it off, that's for sure. So I've loved hearing what you've been saying, your journey, your story, and how much you're now giving back. It's incredible to see all of the different boards that you're sitting on and the charities that you're working with. What's going to be coming next for you, Keith?
Um, you know, I really don't know. Yes, I've because we're in lockdown at the moment, and I kind of stopped the work that I was doing just before lockdown started. I haven't really pursued that much. You know, it's actually fun enough. Somebody actually approached me, oddly enough, about doing a series of podcasts, but I haven't done any. So that's one of the things I'm sort of thinking about. I have been approached by somebody else about maybe trying to put a book together. You know, again, you know, my overriding thing is, yeah, but who would read it? So if I get to the point where I'm convinced that people would actually read it, then I might do that. I haven't really decided exactly what comes next. You know, I'm taking some time. I'm not as busy as I was.
I think when you say who would read it, it's more a case of why you'd write it. And something you said earlier, it's all about changing perception.
Hmm.
And if that was your focus, perhaps then that would be a reason for you to do it.
Yes, that's true. Funnily enough, I was talking to my wife about this a couple of days ago because partly because of the open letter I wrote to the music industry, you know, following the George Floyd death and blackout day, as it was called, where people turned off all their Instagram feeds and people stopped work for a day. And I was saying, I remember a conversation I had with a guy who was a product manager for one of my artists. And this was years ago, we're talking like 30 years ago. And we were sitting actually at a photo shoot. And while the photo shoot was going on, because these things can be very long, you know, sitting with this guy in his car and we were chatting away. We were chatting about all kinds of things that are broad and long, you know, they're just talking about stuff. And at one point, having talked for, you know, maybe an hour and a half, he said to me, "Yeah, but it's kind of different for you, really, because you're not really black." And I said, "What?" He said, "Well, you know, I mean, you're not really black. I mean, you know, like, you know, black. You're not like a street black kind of." And I realized in that moment that rather than change his perception of what black people are, he would rather label me as not black, because he had a perception of what black people were and, what it meant to be black, and didn't realize that black people could be just like him, just as middle class with the same depth and range of knowledge or anything like that. But rather than say, well, hang on a minute, I didn't realize that there were black people who had the same experiences I had, the same life experience, and so he would rather say that I wasn't really black than change his opinion. And so, it's important to change people's opinions.
How did you feel when he said that?
To be honest, I was just incredulous. I just could not believe. First of all, I couldn't believe that he thought it, and I couldn't believe that he said it, because at the time that he said it, he didn't think there was anything wrong with saying that. To this day, I've never spoken to him about it. I haven't seen him for years and years and years. I never spoke to him about it again, because what was the point? But I always remember it. Actually, if he listens to this podcast, he'll probably remember it too for the first time.
Well, it's certainly a good starting point for one of your podcast series or a chapter in your book. That is for sure.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good point. Actually, and maybe yes, maybe you're not really black. That's a great title, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
But this is the thing, isn't it? The creative talking through of concepts and of different medium and what a medium can actually give people. I love podcasting because people plug these podcasts into their ears and they are on a walk or they're in the gym or they're doing housework or whatever they're doing, but they can put their own images to voices and they can also find things that relate to their lives and they can project their own movies, their own stories whilst listening to what you're saying. And for me, that's the magic of the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a new art form.
Mm.
I haven't got all the way with it yet. I don't listen to that many podcasts. I'm afraid I'm still wedded to music. So when I have a minute, I'm listening to either some new music or something musical, because that's what really moves me. But there's no question that podcast has a place. I know my wife listens to podcasts all the time, and many of my family members are listening and recommending them. And I think it's a really important new art form because, first of all, I think that people's attention spans have changed, and people aren't, as I said earlier, prepared to necessarily listen to a whole album's worth of music by people. And also, I think that the podcast often puts things in context which people haven't understood. And so, when used properly, I think it's a really important art form, and an important medium. I need to get with it. I need to get with the program.
Absolutely. And what's so special is you can put music in it as well. It doesn't have to just be you can give illustrations of pieces of music in the middle of a podcast.
Yeah, I need somebody to help me do that. I mean, I think what I need to do if I'm ever going to do a decent podcast is get a decent editor, because I just jump from place to place and I'm not very good yet at focusing.
Well, I'm sure in the music industry, you know the right person.
Like I say, somebody's actually asked me. There's a music industry guy who has asked me about podcasting, and he has a whole sort of podcast company, and it's quite a big one. First of all, I have to have the confidence that people want to listen, and then I have to have the focus to get the series together. There are a couple of people I'd like to talk to on podcast, who are people who have got even longer experience in the music industry than I have, and have really quite interesting background stories. And I'd like to get their stories out there. It's a matter of how I do that.
Well, for me, I just imagine that I've got one person listening, and if one person is listening, then I'm very happy. And I know that there are a lot more. So just to have that one person who you think would be interested in hearing that story, target them, and then you've got a podcast.
Great advice. I'll try and I'll try and do that. I've actually spoken to a couple of guys about doing it. So maybe before lockdown finishes, I'll call them up and see if they're amenable to having a conversation with me for further transmission.
I think when anyone ever suggests to you that you should write a book or you should have a podcast, you've already got an audience.
Oh, that's a good way of thinking. Yeah, a couple of people have said to me, "Oh, you should write a book." And I'm going, "Well, yeah, who's going to read it?" Because the thing is, I'm not well known, and that's as much by design as anything. I say I'm not on social media, and that's definitely by design. And so I'm thinking to myself, yeah, that's all very well, but nobody really knows who I am, which is good. I quite like that. I've never really craved and still don't crave the limelight. That's not my position. That's not my role. People with real talent should be in the limelight. And in some ways, I kind of balk at the new 15 seconds of fame thing that everybody feels they have the right to be famous. I don't. I'm not really with that. I think that yes, you have the right to be famous if you've done something exceptional. People want to be famous just for being famous, and that's a weird thing for me.
Yeah, and you've worked with some very talented people and supported them through their careers. And I think that a lot of people want to hear that story as much as the people who are in the limelight. They want to see how someone can support others. I think that people who are on this podcast who come to me, they always underestimate what they do and why they do it. And for me, I know that someone out there will be inspired by your story, because other people will say, well, that's what I want to do. Yeah, I don't want to have the limelight, but I'd love to do something like he's done.
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, I hope that it does inspire people, and not because it's me, but because kind of because they didn't know that there were people like me, if you like. The fact that it can happen, and sometimes if you follow your dreams, then it happens. It works out for you. I think one of the things that happens a lot now, and I think about, is that a lot of people who are impressed or um, I think inspired is probably too strong a word, but along that journey to being inspired by the career of someone like me, it's actually through the prism of history. So if I say, "Oh, I remember, taking Stevie Wonder on stage with Bob Marley in 1979," which I do remember, then the prism of history makes it seem a lot more remarkable because of the fame of something like Bob Marley, and people don't realize that people still alive who have a connection, if you like, with Bob Marley. So, to a lot of young people, what they are doing now will be very important through the prism of history. So, I think it's important that they don't discount their current achievements. People who are currently doing stuff, will ultimately be famous because what they're doing will, in reflection, have some real importance and significance. You know, I think what bothers me, I say, well, people kind of chasing instant fame. I think like a lot of, I guess like a lot of recording artists, when you look at the body of their work and you look on how long it's lasted, that's kind of how you judge people. You judge people by the long-term impact they make rather than the one-day impact.
I love that. I love that whole reflection of the prism of history. And it reminds me of my daughter's, just before lockdown, she just went over to Auschwitz and she was responsible for passing on the knowledge for the next generation. So she was taken out there. She met someone who was involved in the whole camp,
Yeah,
and it's because there are very few survivors. And so what they've done is they've got projects with hundreds of school children from around the world to come in and meet the people, and so that they can have that story passed down the generations, so it's
yeah,
not forgotten.
that's
And
fantastic. That's great.
it's an amazing experience, and she's very honored and privileged to have been part of that project. So just as your responsibility is almost to document the stories that you've got, that you've had for future generations, and of the people that you have met who are no longer with us.
Yeah. Well, maybe I should get on with that next. Now that you ask me what I should do, maybe that's what I'll start today.
Sounds fantastic. Keith, it's been amazing speaking to you today. I've absolutely loved our conversation. Could you leave the audience with one final message?
See, that's a really difficult thing to do because, like I say, I don't really see my place to preach to people. I think that the one final thing I'll say is really try, if you are really inspired by something, try it. Follow your dreams because you never know what might happen. I think the important thing is never look back and wonder what would have happened if I had gone after what I really wanted, rather than settle for something less. Try and go for, what you're really passionate about.
Thank you for listening to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson, and if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave me a 5-star iTunes review. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook, and become a member of the inspiring, uplifting, and positive Focus on Why Facebook group. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why.